With all appropriate respect, he is nothing more than a puppet who has memorized how to preach. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar issued the statement wearing a faint, self-assured smile. It was the look of a lawmaker who had dominated numerous committee rooms exactly like this one. The television cameras were rolling and her backers seated directly behind her nodded in unified agreement. It was a flawless soundbite, flawlessly crafted for a trending social media snippet, and she knew it perfectly. Positioned across the table, Vice President J.D. Vance stayed completely expressionless. He took the lid off his pen, inscribed a single, concise note into a worn leather notebook, and let the heavy silence hang for 3 excruciating seconds before raising his eyes. "Are you completely done, Representative?" he asked courteously. "Please utilize whatever time you require." I would absolutely loathe to cut short a concluding argument. Just 9 seconds later, that self-assured smile had completely disappeared. The drinking glass held tightly in her hand was noticeably shaking. The fresh ink on the placard identifying her position was smearing into a chaotic, dark blur. And Ilhan Omar was staring at the television cameras, abruptly praying with intense desperation that they were switched off. She had marched into that hearing room with the singular goal of tearing him apart. She had absolutely no idea what was written inside that leather notebook. It was intended to be a routine legislative markup, an utterly ordinary foreign aid session, the precise kind of administrative formality that fills afternoon C-SPAN broadcasts and clears out the viewing gallery by early afternoon. Lawmakers had drifted in holding coffee mugs and informational dossiers, while staff members leaned against the back walls, absent-mindedly browsing on their phones. The committee leader had initiated the meeting, and for the first 11 minutes, the events were exactly as monotonous as everyone had predicted. J.D. Vance was seated alone at the testimony table. There was no army of consultants flanking him, no giant piles of informational folders stacked up like protective barriers. He carried only one leather notebook, rubbed smooth at the corners, and a solitary pen. He had given statements in front of congressional panels frequently enough to realize that the people who show up carrying the most documents are usually the ones with the least actual substance to provide. Then, Representative Omar officially claimed the floor, and the whole mood inside the space immediately transformed. She didn't ask a question about international assistance. She swiveled in her chair, performing a deliberate, measured turn toward the testimony table, and directed her verbal assault straight at the individual sitting there. "Mr. Chairman, before we advance any further, I think we require total transparency about the person we have called to speak to us today," Omar asserted. Her voice projected with ease, sharp and colorful. It was the speaking rhythm of someone used to dominating spaces just like this. Because sitting in front of us is a vice president who built his whole career as the loyal underling of a man who tried to burn down this exact democracy. He doesn't truly speak for the blue-collar Americans he pens autobiographies about. He answers to one billionaire and one bloated ego. A slight, triumphant grin touched her mouth. He is, with all appropriate respect, nothing more than a puppet who has memorized how to preach. And I think the American public deserves to know that before listening to a single word he says about international relations. Behind her back, a lower-ranking representative nodded in agreement. A staffer resting against the outer wall smiled broadly and quickly typed a text. It was an incredible quote. Sharp, unforgettable, and perfectly designed for a vertical video clip. Omar knew it landed perfectly. She had forged her entire public image on producing incredible quotes. She intertwined her fingers and waited, completely anticipating him to react with indignation. J.D. Vance displayed not a single drop of indignation. He let the quietness suspend in the room. 1 second, 2, 3 painfully extended seconds. Enough time that people in the chamber began shifting awkwardly in their seats. He took the cap off his pen, noted one small detail in his leather-covered notebook, and only afterward lifted his gaze. "Are you completely done, Representative?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost soft. "Please take whatever time you need. I would despise interrupting a concluding statement." A ripple of nervous laughter drifted through the room. Omar's smile tightened in defense. "I am done." "Wonderful." Vance closed the notebook with a soft thud. "Since you requested transparency about who is sitting at this table, I think that is an excellent idea. Let us be totally transparent about the two of us. You and I, the full picture. Exactly how you asked. The balance in the chamber abruptly shifted. The staffer near the wall immediately lost his smile. "I would like to start with a remark you delivered," Vance began. "Not today. Today you have been extremely careful. I am talking about public, documented remarks given on several occasions in front of television cameras exactly like these. You compare the United States of America to Hamas and to the Taliban. You use the phrase unimaginable horrors, and you place this country in the very same bucket as fighters who throw acid into the faces of little girls just for committing the offense of walking to a classroom. That is a deliberate, dishonest distortion of—" Omar fiercely leaned toward her microphone. "Then fix the record. I have the full quote. I can read every single word into the official transcript along with the date slowly if you need me to. The context was about making every international government answerable for wartime atrocities, a benchmark that a true leader, unlike a television patriot, would actually— Here is what intrigues me," Vance pushed onward, continuing as though she hadn't spoken at all. The absolute calmness in his speech never shattered. That was the element commentators would point out afterward. The reality that he never once raised his voice, never once took the bait. Somehow, that self-control gave every word massive weight. This country pulled your family out of a refugee camp. A camp. It fed you when you were facing famine. It schooled you. It gave you a language, a passport, the right to vote, and then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, it gave you one of exactly 435 open seats in the United States House of Representatives. He stopped, locking eyes with her, and his tone dropped slightly. "There are farmers in my home state of Ohio whose great-grandparents are buried in that dirt, who pay their taxes, who lose their children in our wars, and who will never come within 100 miles of the leather seat you are sitting in right this moment. America didn't just open its door for you, Representative. America walked you to the very front of the theater and handed you the microphone. The room had become completely still, and the very first thing you chose to do with that microphone," Vance declared, "was to compare the people who gave it to you to terror groups. A reporter sitting in the front row had stopped typing entirely and was simply staring. That," Omar snapped back, real anger now pouring from her as her face flushed, "is the oldest, most disgusting trick in your whole playbook. You are telling an immigrant woman to stay grateful and quiet. You are claiming that just because I used to be a refugee, I have given up my constitutional right to criticize this government. That isn't patriotism, Mr. Vice President. That is a jail cell. And you appear very happy building it for women who look like me." It was a strong rebuttal, and she leaned into it, sensing a chance to recover. She turned slightly toward the broadcast cameras, pulling her classic move whenever she felt the crowd's energy turning her way. "This is their normal playbook," she announced, her voice finding its usual commanding pace. "Whenever a woman who looks like me speaks an uncomfortable truth about American empire building, about who really profits from our wars, about whose children we sacrifice to protect whose profit margins, they refuse to argue the real facts. They can't do it. So they question if I even have the right to speak. They go searching for the exact camp where I was born. They softly, politely remind me that I am just a guest in a house where I should feel lucky just to take up space." She let her eyes sweep across the room. "I am not a guest, Mr. Vice President. I was democratically elected by the American people. And absolutely no military lapel pin gives you the authority to decide what truths a former refugee is allowed to say." A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the representatives sitting behind her. One of them whispered quietly, "That's exactly right." For a brief moment, the room belonged to her again, and she sensed it. She leaned back, sporting the faint, self-assured smile of a lawmaker who had turned a vicious attack into a roaring applause 1,000 times before. J.D. Vance let her enjoy the moment. He waited until the surge of her victory had fully peaked and began to fade. Then he gave a slow nod as though recognizing a solid point and leaned forward. "No, ma'am, I am a United States Marine. I would defend your right to criticize this country with my own life, specifically because I have been sent to places where people had absolutely no such freedoms, and I have seen the horrific toll it takes on them. Criticizing is an act of patriotism. I have done a huge amount of it myself, very loudly." He casually opened the leather notebook again, completely unhurried. "Criticism works like this. Our foreign policy is deeply broken. It sounds like that war was a massive mistake, and good soldiers died for nothing. I will stand right next to you and yell both of those things until I lose my voice. He lifted his gaze. But that is not what you did. You didn't criticize the country that saved your life. You ranked it. You took the nation that pulled your family out of the mud, and you put it on the exact same level as the governments from which we save other desperate people. There is a massive gap between criticizing your own home and actively hating it. And we are going to spend the next few minutes looking at exactly how far you have walked across that gap. He turned a single page in his notebook, unbothered by the quiet. 1995. A refugee camp in Kenya. A young girl, 8 years old. And a country on the other side of the globe that she had never seen agrees to take her family in. Not because they earned it, but because that is what this nation, working at its best, simply does. 1997. Full citizenship. 2016. A seat in the State House. 2018. The United States Congress. That isn't my story about you, Representative. That is your story. You have told it beautifully many times, as you should. It is a path that could only happen in one specific country on this whole earth. He locked his eyes on hers. Which is exactly why it knocks the wind out of me to hear you compare this country to the fanatics who would have stoned that 8-year-old girl to death in the town square. You, out of everyone, know exactly what those groups are. You came from the places they run. America is the only wall that stood between you and those groups. And you put them on the exact same level. Omar grabbed her drinking glass. Her hand, for a second, was steady. She took a drink, set the glass back down, and tapped the sides of her paper stack to straighten them, like a bricklayer fixing a broken wall. If this congressional clash is already getting under your skin the way it gripped that chamber, do me a huge favor right now and click that like button. It is the very best way to tell us to keep covering these vital events. Hit that like button and stay tuned, because Vice President Vance hasn't even opened the real file yet. Now let's talk about money, Vance declared. You brought it up. You claimed that I serve one billionaire and one ego. So let's follow the money. Both your money and my money. Out in the open, officially on the record. I think that is a reasonable deal. He pulled a thin folder from under his notebook. He didn't dramatically flip it open for the press cameras. He opened it with the careful, quiet precision of a doctor, checking a file they already knew by heart. In February of 2019, you made a post on social media. 3 specific words that have followed your career ever since. You stated that American political support for Israel was, and I am using your exact words, all about the Benjamins, baby. The Benjamins, $100 bills. Your entire theory of how this political world works, Representative, is that hidden under every ethical position, someone is quietly getting paid. He looked up. And I will tell you something that might actually surprise you. I agree with you. Money is a corrupting force. It corrupts constantly, and it corrupts in the dark. The place where you and I disagree comes down to one question. Whose money and filling whose personal bank account? He turned a paper over. Federal Election Commission reports. Completely public records. Anyone sitting in this room could pull them up on their phone in half a minute. During your political campaigns, your team transferred to a political consulting firm called the E Street Group roughly $2.8 million. He let the huge number hang in the heavy air. $2.8 million coming from donor money. That firm was run by a man named Tim Minette. And during the exact time that those dollars were flooding into his firm, Mr. Minette ended his marriage and married you. A shared whisper broke out softly near the back walls and rolled forward through the room like an ocean wave. The Federal Election Commission looked into that financial setup and cleared it, Omar shot back, her words fast and defensive. A unanimous vote. 6-0. No laws were broken. This is a completely settled matter that was heavily investigated and dismissed years ago. You know this perfectly well, and you're only bringing it back up because you have absolutely no other ammunition. You are absolutely right, Vance nodded calmly. I read the commission's decision. They found no broken laws. I am not standing or sitting here making criminal charges against you. I want that clearly stated in the record. The FEC cleared it. 6-0. I am not arguing with their decision. Saite. He leaned forward just a tiny bit. But you didn't run for this office promising the people of Minnesota that your actions would just be legal. Representative, legal is the very bottom floor. You ran swearing that you would be something completely different. You ran promising your voters that this whole town was a poison swamp, filled with political insiders who fiercely funneled donor money to their romantic partners, only to hide the deals using the language of high morals. He tapped the document once with his finger. $2.8 million of hard-working people's money funneled straight through the business of the man you married. And what's more, this is the part I find truly shocking. An extra $138,000 sent after you made a public statement, cutting business ties. After the news cameras left. After the serious promise. Of course, every single dollar sent to that firm was labeled as valid, documented campaign work. "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," Vance repeated quietly, pushing her own phrase back across the table at her like a crushing receipt. "You wrote that about other lawmakers, about their private motives, their loyalties, their hidden financial corruption. But while you were busy writing that exact thought, 2.8 million Benjamins walked straight out of your voters' pockets and right into your own private bank account. So I have to ask you a truthful question. When you look at that pile of money, do you apply the same strict rules to yourself that you aggressively push onto everyone else? Or does your ethical code conveniently stop at your own front door?" Omar's jaw tightened noticeably. She grabbed her drinking glass once more and took a fast gulp. When she put the glass back on the table, she set it down way too hard. It cracked loudly against the shiny wood, ringing in the heavy silence. "You want to preach to me about money?" she challenged, and this time she almost threw herself forward in her chair, her speech cutting and fast. "You wrote a book profiting off the pain of poor white people in Appalachia. You sold their suffering to massive publishing companies. After that, you deposited the royalty checks and right away took a job with Silicon Valley venture capitalists. The exact same corporate bosses who shipped blue-collar factory jobs to other countries. You made a fortune telling a terrible tragedy that you ran away from, and you never bothered to look back. Don't you ever sit in that chair and play the modest, honest country lawyer with me?" It was a crushing comeback, delivered with incredible speed, and the whole room felt the hit. Multiple lawmakers turned their heads toward Vance to see his response. A staffer softly said, "Oh," under his breath. Omar, sensing a weak spot, pushed her attack. "You want to talk about families making money through political campaigns?" she urged, leaning even nearer to her microphone, her finger fiercely tapping the desk. "Take a good look at this whole capital city. Look at the political strategists, the data pollsters, the brothers-in-law on official payrolls, the husbands getting huge lobbying deals. You specifically singled me out of a group of 435 elected lawmakers. You walked into this room holding a file only on the immigrant woman of color. And you expect the people watching to believe the story that this is motivated by morals, instead of something much older and much uglier than morals?" She fiercely turned toward the television cameras. "A firm did valid, contracted work and got paid for it. The specific oversight board built exactly for this situation looked into it and gave a unanimous pass. That is the beginning, the middle, and the end of this story. Unless obviously you need it to be a totally different story. And you desperately need it to be something else, right? Because that something else is the only sad ammo you brought into this hearing." For a few tight seconds, the energy belonged completely to her. A lawmaker sitting behind her nodded with strong support. The mood in the chamber hung in the air, truly uncertain as to who would finally win the exchange. Vance took the whole attack. He even gave a slow, agreeing nod, the movement of a heavyweight fighter admitting that a hard punch had landed cleanly. "That is a totally fair criticism," he answered. "I did write that book. The public bought it, and it forever changed my financial situation. I will never try to hide that. You have the right to hold whatever thoughts you want about the man I became." He stopped for a moment. "But here's the main difference. And it is the only difference that matters in this room. I never built my whole public image on the core claim that making money is the evil, hidden sin of every single person living in America, except for me. You did. You turned the bitter mistrust of other people's money into your whole political brand. And that is exactly the sort of claim a person must be able to survive when it is read back out loud to them. And $2.8 million shows that you cannot survive it. A thin, spreading line of water had escaped from the base of her drinking glass and was slowly soaking into the edge of her paper stack. She hadn't noticed it yet. The television cameras, though, had $2.8 million. If the massive scale of that number just hit you, leave a comment below. Just type the word Benjamins in the chat so our crew knows you're really paying attention. We check every single comment. Then stay focused right here, because the proof the vice president reveals next is the exact point from which she never managed to bounce back. A staff worker moved quietly along the back wall and bent down to whisper something urgently into the ear of one of Representative Omar's main assistants. The assistant's face twisted. She quickly wrote a note onto a piece of paper and tried to hand it down the line toward the congresswoman. But the committee leader was closely watching the handoff, and the note's journey stopped halfway down the chairs. Whatever pressing alert it held, Omar never saw it. Near the front of the room, a political journalist who had spent the whole meeting slouched lazily against the wall suddenly stood straight up and quietly turned his phone sideways to start filming video. Two other reporters instantly copied the action. High up in the guest gallery, an onlooker wearing a faded Vietnam veteran's hat leaned forward, holding the railing with both hands. The whole chamber had begun a shared, silent understanding that they were watching a historic crash, something the political world would study for years. Vance simply laid his crossed hands on top of the table and let the room fall into complete quiet. And that quiet echoed louder than any word he had said all day. "I want to read exactly 8 words to you," he said quietly. "Not my chosen words. Your chosen words, taken from a speech you gave to a live crowd. I know exactly what you are getting ready to." Omar started. Some people did something. The chamber did not gasp. It made a sound much weirder and much scarier. It simply stopped breathing. "You stood at a speaking podium," Vance went on, "and you described the planned attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the most deadly event of mass murder ever committed on American soil, as some people did something. Some people. Something." He let the painful quiet stretch until it felt physically hurting. 2,977 people died on that exact morning, Representative. They were not just some people. They had names. They had kids who are now adults and who still leave an empty seat at their dinner tables. There is a man named Nicholas Harris Jr. His mom, Frances, was murdered inside those buildings. On the memorial date, he stood at Ground Zero, wearing a shirt printed with your exact words. And he read the names of the dead into a microphone, standing right in front of those mourning families. Because you decided to shrink the most painful day of grief in their whole lives into a casual brush-off, into a situation that, I quote, was about the civil liberties of a community being collectively punished for the actions of a few. Omar's voice broke at the edges, and she clearly heard the crack in her own tone. That realization seemed to scare her much more than anything Vance had said. That phrase was forcefully and purposely cut from its real context by political agents just like you to... "Then give me the missing context," Vance ordered, his hands staying perfectly still and crossed. "I will happily wait. Teach this room what possible context turns 3,000 terrible funerals into something. Take every minute you need. You wanted transparency from me. I am asking for the exact same rule from you. What are the specific words that come after 'some people did something' that makes it okay for a lawmaker that this country saved from poverty to use them?" She tried to speak, stopped, and tried again. "You are cruelly using the pain of..." I understand exactly what that pain was. And right here, for the first time all day, Vance's speaking rhythm drastically changed. It didn't get louder. It turned into something stiff and ice-cold. He suddenly dropped the polite title he had used the whole meeting. "Here is the harsh truth, Ilhan. I have sat in living rooms with Gold Star mothers. I have carefully folded the American flag and handed it across a shiny coffin into the shaking hands of a wife who couldn't stop weeping. So I am going to say this one time. I will say it with total clarity, and then we will finish this talk." He locked his eyes right onto hers. 3,000 murdered Americans are not some people. And burning to death while sitting at your desk, or being pushed to fall from a 100-floor window because the fire coming up behind you was the worst choice, is not something. You are generally known as one of the best speakers in this entire government building. Everyone sitting in this room knows that. Your political enemies know it. I know it. You had access to every single word in the English dictionary on that afternoon. And yet, out of all those open choices, when talking about the innocent victims who were pushed to jump to their ends, you purposely grabbed the 2 most empty, uncaring words found in the dictionary. That was not a mistaken slip of the tongue. A mistaken slip is getting a calendar day wrong. That remark was a purposeful display of your true character, and the whole country saw exactly what you hold in your heart. A woman watching in the top balcony pressed both hands tightly over her mouth. Somewhere in the chamber, a steel chair scraped against the wood floor and right away stopped. Omar's eyes were shining and filled with tears. And then, backed into a corner, she naturally reached for the very last defense tool she had in her bag. "You are setting up this whole show," she announced, her voice both shaking with fear and getting louder. "Exactly because I am a black woman. Because I am of the Muslim religion. Because I am a former refugee who stubbornly refused to stay obedient and quiet. And right-wing men like you are totally unable to handle the sight of someone who looks like me holding a seat of power like this. This is not a government review hearing. This is pure racism wearing an expensive custom suit. And every single citizen watching this feed from their house knows it." It was the tactical move the whole room had been waiting for. The race card slapped face up onto the shiny wood table. And it was the exact move that J.D. Vance had been excitedly waiting for. She just played the final card in her hand. Now, watch very closely how it gets completely destroyed. If you strongly agree that a person should be judged on the actual words they say, instead of the color of their skin or the religion they practice, then you have to subscribe to this page right away. That belief is the only reason we are here. Click subscribe and watch this happen. J.D. Vance chose not to give a counter-argument. An argument was not needed. He just leaned back into his seat and let his eyes wander purposely 2 spots to his right along the testimony table. A man who had stayed totally quiet during the whole messy meeting leaned forward to his own microphone. He wore a dark custom suit jacket. A small metal pin caught the ceiling lights. The crossed flags of the United States and the United States Marine Corps. The official nameplate sitting on the table said, "Major, retired, Samir Haddad." "Congresswoman," he started. His voice was low, carrying an accent and totally empty of rage. "I was born in Beirut. I follow the Muslim religion. I did my daily prayers this morning before walking into this facility. I moved to this country as a poor teenager with absolutely nothing in my pockets, living under the exact same conditions your family did." He took a short pause. "I wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps for 22 straight years. I personally carried my friends off mountainsides in broken pieces. I personally buried a number of them under that flag with my own 2 hands." The chamber was frozen. "Not one single person sitting at this testimony table," Haddad said strongly, "has said a single word about your religious faith, or your skin color, or the refugee camp where you started. The vice president showed your campaign team's money records, which are public documents, and he showed a speech you gave, which is a public document. That covers the absolute whole of the things that have happened here today. And the second you realized that you had no good excuse for the money issues or the terrible words, you frantically reached out for me. You tried to use my skin color and the name of my God as a weapon, and you tried to lift them up and hold them in front of your face like a defense shield." His jaw tightened for a second. "I did not live through the nightmares that I survived just so you could hide behind soldiers like me the second the questions get tough. Put down the shield and answer his actual questions." The pressure in the room finally broke. It didn't explode into clapping. Not right away. It exploded into a huge let-go of raw sound energy. Wooden seats creaked. Held-in breath was let out all at once. A deep, shocked wave of pure disbelief that bounced from wall to wall. And then, while that messy noise still floated in the air, a much quieter thing happened that hit much harder. 3 spots to Omar's left, a seasoned Democratic lawmaker, a politician who had often shown up on television networks specifically to defend her name, a guy who had openly called her critics racist while looking into his own TV cameras, carefully closed his folder. He put the lid on his pen. He stood up from his chair and he walked right out the side door of Hearing Rooms 2118. He didn't slam the thick wooden door to make a point. He didn't give an emotional speech or hand out a statement. He simply left. And the soft metal click of that door locking after he walked out was, in a very real way, the loudest sound made during the whole meeting. Every single political worker in that chamber understood exactly what that exit meant. The defense squad was giving up. The political guards had left their spots. Omar saw it happen. She watched her last remaining supporter as he disappeared out of the view of the television cameras. and something deeply broke in her attitude. She lunged for the drinking glass. Her hand was violently shaking now, with no effort to hide it. And as she lifted the top, the water violently splashed over the side, pouring right onto the pile of printed papers set up in front of her. It washed over the top page, the paper showing her own official title typed in dark letters. The ink, already melting from the earlier small leak, quickly washed outward, turning into a giant, dirty gray smear. She slammed the glass back down. It hit hard against the wood, once, twice, before finally going quiet. J.D. Vance watched her shaking hands. So did every single high-quality camera in the room. "I will make this short to make it easy," Vance said. There was no feeling of winning pride in his voice. If anything, he showed pure tiredness. It was the specific, deep tiredness of a man who had to say a true, ugly fact into the official record and got absolutely no joy from doing it. "You called me a puppet who has memorized how to preach." Fine. I would deeply rather preach religious words that I actually believe in, instead of burn through $2.8 million that I publicly scolded other people for getting. I would much rather swear loyalty to a country that pulled my poor neighbors out of the financial mud, instead of being great at making up thousands of reasons why that country is supposedly bad. He leaned hard toward the microphone, getting ready for his final remark. The chamber dropped into such a deep level of total quiet that the audio gear clearly picked up the quiet, electric hum of the fluorescent lights attached to the ceiling. "You wanted transparency, Ilhan. Let me give it. America handed you the microphone." He stopped for one painful second. "Hand it back." The committee leader's wooden hammer never hit the block. For a long, painful time, not a single person inside hearing room 2118 moved an inch. Omar stayed sitting behind her ruined, wet documents. Her mouth hung open a little, making no sound. And her eyes weren't looking at Vance. Her stare was fixed on the back wall, right at the thick group of television cameras. Every single red recording light was glowing. Every single one of them was still working, actively broadcasting the terrible moment, live and unedited, to a crowd of more than 9 million people who would replay and study this exact string of seconds for the rest of the week and the week after that. And in that exact second, totally clear on her face for the whole country to read, was the one feeling she was completely unable to hide. She intensely prayed those cameras were turned off. High up in the guest balcony, the watcher wearing the old Vietnam hat stood up slowly. He didn't yell a chant. He didn't clap his hands. He just stood up straight, taking the stance that men from his time take when something they thought was gone forever has suddenly appeared back in the room. A few seconds later, a female watcher sitting 2 rows away stood up to join him, followed by a younger man standing near the exit door. Until a whole, quiet, straight line of people in the balcony had stood up, acting in a silence that held much more power than any loud cheering. Not one single reporter working in the press group wrote down the word clapping, because it wasn't a cheer. It was something much older. It was a room full of people who had suffered through years of constant lectures, claiming that their country was an evil business. Finally watching someone say, loudly on the official transcript, with the television cameras recording every second, that it clearly was not. That is the exact quote that will take over every single phone screen in America by tomorrow morning. If watching that gave you chills, right away share this video with one person in your contacts who really needs to see this. That is the exact way these important facts spread. Click the like button, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share the link. Do all 4. Because the last minute of this government meeting holds the thing that absolutely nobody in that room saw coming. The official meeting didn't really end so much as it awkwardly melted away. The committee leader called for a short break that every political worker in the room right away knew was going to last forever. Lawmakers stood up in small, separated circles, talking in quiet, anxious voices. A huge number of them threw long looks over their shoulders toward the testimony table, matching the exact dark interest of drivers slowing down to stare at a terrible car crash, totally unable to look away while feeling a slight bit of shame for watching. Omar tried to gather her documents. The wet papers had stuck tightly together, ripping cleanly at the edges the minute she tried to lift them. As a result, she left them on the table. She completely stayed away from looking at the press group as she pushed herself up from her seat. Of course, this only made sure that the camera workers zoomed in closer and kept the tight shot on her walking out. By the second she walked into the outer hall, the video clip was already exploding across the web. One assistant's phone lit up, followed rapidly by another. Then a whole dozen buzzed at the same time. It was that clear, rolling shake of a specific thing going viral right then. Hand it back. 3 minutes of tight arguing perfectly cut down into a clean 40-second video. The text added to it, shooting past 1 million views before the elevator doors even had a chance to shut. Across the major news channels, the bottom screen text banners were frantically changing on live TV, and on the specific media sites that usually rush to give her quick defense, the complete lack of reporting acted as its own huge news story. The TV hosts, who normally would have spent a whole hour-long block agreeing with her views, just said that they would offer a deep breakdown of the meeting soon. That promised breakdown never happened. Major Haddad walked out through the main front doors. At the bottom of the giant stone steps, a small group of people had naturally gathered, waiting for him to come out. They weren't official media workers, they were just regular people. An older man wearing a faded VFW hat stood in the middle. He reached out, grabbed Haddad's right hand, and held the shake for a full second longer than a normal polite hello. He didn't say a single word, purely because there were absolutely no words that needed to be said. Haddad gave one stiff nod of respect and kept walking forward into the late afternoon daylight. J.D. Vance remained as the absolute final soul to depart from the suffocating confines of the congressional building. The cavernous chamber, which mere moments ago had vibrated with the chaotic, raw energy of a historic political collision, now descended into an eerie, hollow silence. The heavy oak doors had clicked shut behind the fleeing lawmakers and panicked aides, leaving Vance completely alone amidst the abandoned briefcases and scattered briefing binders. Moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace, he stepped toward the thick, polished mahogany of the witness table. There, resting exactly where he had placed it at the beginning of the ordeal, was his worn leather notebook. He reached down and allowed his fingers to trace the scuffed edges of the binding. It was a remarkably simple analog object in a room designed for high-definition digital theater. Yet, it was the exact same unassuming item he had transported inside, representing the solitary piece of armor and the only weapon he had required for the grueling intellectual battle. Suddenly, the profound quiet of the room was fractured by rubber soles squeaking against the polished floorboards. A younger assistant, practically hyperventilating and visibly vibrating with a cocktail of adrenaline and disbelief, rushed up to his side. The young man's eyes were wide, darting between his brightly glowing smartphone screen and the vice president's stoic face. "Sir," the aide stammered, fighting to catch his breath as he attempted to articulate the digital explosion happening outside. "It is absolutely the top story. It is leading every single—" "I know," Vance cut in. His voice was devastatingly quiet, entirely devoid of the frantic urgency that consumed the young staffer. It was a tone of absolute, grounded certainty. He engaged the metallic clicker of his pen. The sharp sound of the ballpoint tip retracting echoed softly. With a fluid, practiced motion, he slid the writing instrument smoothly into the interior silk pocket of his impeccably tailored custom jacket. Before pivoting toward the exit, Vance cast his gaze across the dividing space, locking his eyes onto the vacant, high-backed leather chair previously occupied by Representative Omar. He stared at the discarded drinking glass, sitting abandoned inside the miniature, reflective puddle of water it had violently generated during her retreat. The liquid was still slowly creeping across the varnished wood. His eyes shifted to her official nameplate. The bold ink that had proudly declared her formal title was currently surrendering to the moisture, rapidly dissolving and bleeding into a blurred, muddy gray smudge. It was evaporating right there under the unforgiving, high-intensity glare of the studio lighting. Observing this wreckage, Vance did not offer even the faintest hint of a smirk. For a prolonged, fleeting second, his features settled into a mask of profound, weary gravity. He looked exactly like a person who extracted absolutely zero joy and zero happiness from being factually, devastatingly right about the profound ethical and moral faults of another human being. With the silent observation concluded, he tucked the scuffed leather diary securely beneath his arm. He turned his back on the chamber and strode with purposeful steps outward into the blinding, natural light of the late afternoon. He walked straight toward the chaotic frenzy of the waiting media cameras, stepping directly into the crosshairs of a fractured nation. It was a country actively busily arguing about the only 8 syllables that had ever truly mattered inside that room, and realizing that, after a seemingly endless wait, A definitive, uncompromising final answer had finally been given.